So what's one theme that happens over and over and over again and starts at the garden and finds its end in the book of Revelation? We're going to talk about that today. But before we do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and that notification bell, and maybe a like so you don't miss any content. With that out of the way, let's go. What is up, everyone? Welcome to the Puzzle Piece Exegete, where we put the pieces of scripture together one verse at a time in order to further our love for the word and our walk with God. You know, one of the things we want to do when we study the Bible is look for repetition, things that occur over and over and over, whether it's a word or a phrase or a theme. We want to make sure we underline that, circle it, whatever we need, highlight it, whatever we need to do, and see how they might connect throughout the Bible. And one of those that we see again and again is this theme of exile and exodus. Exile and Exodus. And in fact, the first place we actually see this is in the book of Genesis, in the first couple of pages, right? In the garden. God created all things and it was good, and he places an image of himself and places it at the center of this garden temple and to work it and to keep it. And we see that a cosmic ruin happens, right? A fall, a tragic fall happens, and humanity is essentially exiled from the gardens, what I like to call exile prime, or the very first exile, right? Everything was shalom in the garden, right? Everything was as it should be. Humanity was dwelling with God in the cool of the day as God was walking with them in the cool of the day, the overlap of God's space and our space, everything as it should have been. God was dwelling with and in his creation, and humanity was connected to that life-giving source, namely God. And humanity chose to go its own way, chose to rebel, and as a result of that, they were exiled from this garden temple, from the presence of God, exiled from a right relationship with God, and exiled from the vocation that they had to be the royal priesthood people in the presence of God. And so that's the very first exile that's seeking resolution. All the Bible is kind of leading towards this, driving towards this, the dwelling of God with men, and so that shalom can be restored. And eventually we see that in the book of Revelation. But along the way, in those bookends of Genesis and Revelation, we have a whole bunch of different exiles and exodus echoes. Sometimes they're emphatic, sometimes they're not, but we see this again and again. And so what I want to do is kind of go over some examples of where we see this recurring theme of exile and exodus. So again, we started off in the garden. The next place we kind of see this is Noah chapter 6, right, where God floods the world, and essentially humanity is exiled from existence. And what we have is God saving a remnant, a faithful remnant, Noah and his family, and they exile, or they have an exodus from this ark. They leave the ark and God starts afresh. Then we kind of pick up from the patriarchs, right, and it's Jacob and his family. Remember, Joseph is in Egypt, right, and he's in a high position with Pharaoh, and there's a famine in the land, and essentially Jacob and the 11 other brothers come with Joseph, and they stay in the land of Goshen. So they're in Canaan, right, and they are exiled. And when I say exile essentially means outside the promised land, outside the actual place where God's people are called to be. In this particular case, it's the promised land, right? The promise that God gave to Abraham, that he will give them land. And so we see that Jacob and his family are exiled, as it were, in Goshen, and they're there for 400 years, right? And they flourish, the people flourish, and they grow as a nation. And eventually God raises up Moses and Aaron to have a exodus, right? That's what the book of Exodus. That's kind of where we get the biggest idea of Exodus, right? And so God has an exodus of his people, and they meet at Mount Sinai. But then what do we have? We have another echo of exile again. But then the people came stiff-necked, and they didn't listen, and then for 40 years they wandered, and they didn't see the promised land, but it was their kids that saw the promised land. And so we have this entrance back into the land of Canaan, Canaan back into the land of promise. So we went from Canaan to Egypt, back to Canaan again. So we have this recurring of exile, Exodus, exile in the desert, back to Exodus into the promised land. And then we have the reoccurrence of the book of Judges. My goodness, if you read the book of Judges, I mean, it's just a cycle again and again and again. You know, the people did what was right in their own eyes. They followed after other gods, and then God had an oppressive nation that was over them and ruled over them, and then God raised up a judge, and the people repented, you know, and then the judge died, and again and again and again this recurring theme of exile and Exodus, you know, being sent to not the promised land, you know, not the way things should be, and then deliverance. We see this again and again and again. And probably the most emphatic two cases of exile we see obviously is in 722 when the Assyrians conquered the northern and took captive the northern 10 tribes, and then later in 586 when the temple was destroyed, the third wave, when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem. Essentially, you know, there's three waves that occurred. 586 was the last wave, and the temple was destroyed in 586. And that, when we think of primary exiles, you know, normally that's the main one, right? And then 70 so odd years later, they were released to their own land. The temple was rebuilt, but still there was this idea of an ongoing, though they were in the land, things were still not as they should be, because they were still under an oppressive regime, you know, and those oppressive regimes continued until we eventually got, I mean, there was the Maccabean revolt, that there was a kind of small period there, but eventually Rome entered the scene, and I mean, that's where we find ourselves in the New Testament, where there was still this, people were in an ongoing state of feeling like they were in exile. Things were not where they should be, you know, and enter the scene of Jesus. And we remember that prime exile in the garden that's seeking resolution. Well, now we have Jesus as the climax of this story, and it is through his work on the cross and through his resurrection and ascension that death was defeated and life was provided. The very life that was lost in the garden, that life-giving source, has now been given through Jesus. And again, we go to the tree of life in the book of Revelation, kind of this bookend of the life and the life, and it's the tree in the very, so we have the tree of life in the book of Genesis, the tree of life in the book of Revelation, and then we have the tree, meaning the cross, that it is the bridge between the two. And we have exile that happened here in the garden, and we have a restoration through the cross, through that tree in the middle, that allows us to have this tree of life that we see in the book of Revelation, and that ultimate Exodus, right? The ultimate entrance into the promised land, new heavens, new earth. And so again, there's many more examples that we can see of echoes and examples of exile and Exodus. But again, this is just a theme that we see occurring again and again. And when we see themes like this, repetition, we want to make sure we see how they can all fit together and how they can fit into the big picture of the story that the Bible's telling. Anyways, guys, with that out of the way, God bless. Have a great day.